Well, now take a look at the very little letter called Jude. And so, a couple of things here about the authorship of this small letter. First of all, questions are oftentimes raised whether or not this is an example of Christian pseudonymity. That is this a work written by someone else but is pretending to be a person by the name of Jude? It is kind of unusual that this would be the case, since Jude, if he is the brother of Jesus, is a relatively unknown figure, or figure of seemingly no significant importance as far as the other writings of the New Testament would suggest. And so to write in the name of a somewhat insignificant figure would be a curious thing. Nevertheless, because he is a brother of Jesus, someone may have thought to use that close relationship in order to write something in his name. Of course, there's been questions about other Judases. So the name Jude is another way of talking about a person named Judas. There are other Judases in the early church. Most likely this would not be Judas Iscariot, because Judas Iscariot, at least from the Gospels tradition, ends up dying. According to Matthew's Gospel, he ends up taking his own life, and according to the book of Acts, he also finds some kind of untimely death. So it most likely would not be Judas Iscariot. Some, could argue that maybe this is Judas, the son of James, who is mentioned in Luke 6:16. Again, we don't know very much about this Judas. Others might say, well, maybe it's Judas Barsabbas, who's mentioned in Acts 15:22. Again, this is another figure who we know very little about. So the idea that's most commonly espoused is that this is Judas, who's Jesus' brother, who is mentioned in Matthew and Mark's Gospel. Or some have wondered, well, maybe it's not really about a individual, since the name Judas is a form of the name Judah. Maybe this is like a writing of the people of Judah, so that this is a letter that is symbolic of the entirety of the Judean people. So that argument really hasn't won a lot of support either within scholarship. So the view that has the most proponents of it is the idea that this was written by Jesus' brother. In terms of the date for this work, well, in terms of the internal evidence in here, verse 17 seems to suggest that maybe all the apostles have died. So Jude 17 says, but you, beloved, must remember the predictions of the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ. So this idea of remember the predictions might suggest that the apostles have died, but certainly it doesn't absolutely require that one thinks that the apostles have died. Now we also have this idea of the faith being kind of used as established doctrine. This is a way of using the word faith that is not how Paul would use it in some of his uncontested letters, but in works like 1 Timothy, Paul does use the idea of faith, kind of like an established doctrine. So Jude seems to hold it in that same way. But if someone was trying to argue that Jude is a later work, they might claim that here the faith suggests a time in which a certain kind of established doctrine has become set. As far as the external evidence for the date of Jude, well, some of the papyri evidence, we have P72, which is known as Papyrus Bodmer. It's a 3rd or 4th century, but we don't know if this is part of a canonical list and therefore Jude is already being recognized as canonical for some. P78, another papyri document, was possibly used as an amulet, so to kind of ward off spirits in the 3rd or 4th century. There is similar language in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, the martyrdom of Polycarp, and possibly the epistle of Barnabas. So these are 2nd century works. They do not cite Jude as a source, but they do have the same kind of language. We also have Clement of Alexandria and Origen are the clearest references to Jude's existence. So this is late 2nd century, early 3rd century. So at least by that date, Clement of Alexandria and Origen know of this work. And there's also some kind of relationship to 2nd Peter that might suggest a knowledge of Jude, or the language of Jude, or the ideas of Jude. So oftentimes Jude and 2nd Peter are kind of read or studied together because of those similarities. Well, we also want to take a look here at the possible recipients of the letter. Since it is in Greek, does that kind of rule out a Palestinian audience? Possibly, but Greek is being spoken in Palestine, but Greek would be the language of the more literate individuals or the aristocracy. It's not typically the language of the commoner, although the common Jew might have a little bit of Greek in order to interact with people kind of for economic purposes, but it really wouldn't make sense to write a letter like this for a wide audience if they're living in Palestine. Do the references to the Old Testament and Jewish apocryphal work indicate that the audience is Jewish? At first, we probably would say yes. However, we have to remember that even Gentile believers would have been instructed in terms of the content of the Old Testament, since Jesus' activities is kind of a continuation of the Old Testament narrative. So the Old Testament would have been taught to Gentiles, and maybe even Jewish apocryphal works may have been introduced to Gentiles as well. So just because these things are there doesn't rule out the possibility that the audience is Gentile. If it is by Jesus' brother, does that make it more likely to have been for diaspora Jews? Again, it's not quite clear. James, the letter of James, as we have noted in a previous podcast on James, seems to be sent to Jewish Christians who are living in the diaspora. Maybe someone inspired by James, or maybe Jude himself, inspired by James or the work of James, decides to do something similar, so that the brothers of Jesus are kind of trying to influence those Jews who are living outside of Palestine, who may have come under the influence of someone like Paul or other individuals, but trying to maintain a kind of an authority or influence over those believers. Again, we don't know. These are just questions that are oftentimes raised about who the recipients might be. So finally, just look here at the purpose for Jude. It seems to urge believers to contend for the faith, but it's not really quite clear what the faith consists of. So trying to, as it were, dig out or uncover the content of the faith is unclear. Jude seems to presuppose that he and his audience already know what the content of that faith is. Jude is really concerned with the internal heretical threat in the church, which seems to lead to a license of immorality. So in other words, this idea that people can just sin and do whatever they want. And also a denial of Jesus Christ as our only sovereign and Lord. And that's interesting that this idea of our only sovereign and Lord, rather than just the only sovereign and Lord. So what does this seem to suggest about the way in which this author looks at the sovereignty and lordship of Jesus, its extent. Jude is also reminding his readers of God's pattern of punishment, especially upon those who reject God's authority, who are greedy, and who are sexually immoral. So these may be some of the problems that Jude sees is going on with his recipients, or it can maybe just a general blanket condemnation of the types of behaviors that Jews oftentimes disparaged were characteristic of a Gentile pagan world in which they lived in. So that's a brief little introduction to the letter of Jude, and we'll get into more of its detail in another podcast.